hat. If I told you that some of Europe's most powerful kings, men who commanded armies and shaped nations, were prisoners of their own bizarre obsessions? Imagine a king in 1380, so convinced his body was made of glass that he padded his clothes to avoid shattering. Another, in 1509, who turned his court into a laboratory of strange remedies as his health collapsed. Or the Sunday King of France in 1643, who transformed even his bathroom breaks into royal ceremonies. These were not fairy tales, they were real monarchs, ruling entire empires while living with quirks that seem almost unbelievable today. Picture this. You are stepping into a European royal palace in the 15th century. Candlelight flickers across golden ceilings, crystal chandeliers sparkle overhead, and hundreds of courtiers bow their heads in reverence. To the people, the king seated on the throne is the very embodiment of absolute power, God's chosen ruler on earth. Yet behind this dazzling facade, many monarchs carried with them habits so bizarre, so eccentric, that history could never forget them. Between the 14th and 18th centuries, Europe saw the rise of powerful dynasties, the Valois and Bourbons in France, the Tudors and Stuarts in England, the mighty Habsburgs in Spain and Austria. This was the age of absolute monarchy, when kings were not only political leaders, but also the center of religion, culture, and law. Isolated in their palaces, shielded from the ordinary world, and unchecked in their authority, these rulers often developed obsessions that transformed into peculiar, even disturbing daily rituals. Take Charles VI of France, who ascended the throne in 1380 at only 11 years old. Decades later, he became known not for military victories, but for the delusion that his body was made of glass. He insisted on wearing padded clothing to protect himself from shattering, a tragic symbol of a fragile mind beneath the crown. Fast forward nearly 2 centuries to 1509, when Henry VIII of England rose to power. To his subjects, he was a strong and commanding monarch, yet privately he was consumed by an obsession with his health and weight. As his body grew frail and swollen with age, he turned his court into a theater of strange medical experiments, relying on concoctions and remedies that often did more harm than good. Then in 1643, a 4-year-old boy named Louis XIV became King of France. Known to history as the Sunday King, he ruled for over 70 years and built the magnificent palace of Versailles. But beneath the grandeur lay quirks that astonished his courtiers. Louis transformed even the most private of acts, such as relieving himself, into a public ceremony attended by nobles, turning his daily routine into a performance of power. And the list does not end there. In the 18th century, Christian VII of Denmark baffled his court with erratic and childish behavior, while Philip V of Spain languished in bouts of depression so severe that he sometimes ruled from his bed, refusing to change clothes or engage with affairs of state. These are not just amusing anecdotes. They reveal something deeper. Absolute power can isolate, distort, and amplify personal fears into habits so extraordinary that they become part of history itself. In this video, we will explore why men who held the fate of nations in their hands also clung to such strange obsessions. Were these quirks mere personal eccentricities, or symptoms of the crushing solitude and pressure of monarchy? And perhaps the bigger question, what does history want us to remember when it preserves these bizarre details of kings who were anything but ordinary? Step into the royal chambers of Europe, and you may expect to find order, authority, and majesty. But what history often shows us instead is fragility kings who were prisoners of their own fears, health conditions, and psychological obsessions. From the late 14th century to the 18th century, some of Europe's most powerful monarchs displayed behaviors so unusual that they blurred the line between eccentricity and madness. One of the earliest and most famous examples was Charles VI of France, reigned 1380–1422. At first, Charles was celebrated as Charles the Beloved, a young monarch full of promise. But in 1392, at the age of 24, he suffered his first major psychotic breakdown while leading a military expedition. From then on, his reign was marked by recurring fits of insanity. Charles developed the bizarre delusion that his body was made entirely of glass. Terrified of shattering into pieces, he ordered his clothes to be reinforced with iron rods or padded with thick layers of cloth. He forbade anyone from touching him, sometimes refusing even a friendly hand on the shoulder. Courtiers were left to manage state affairs while their king wandered his palace in fear, desperately protecting his fragile glass body. For decades, France was essentially ruled by regents and factions, while its monarch lived as a captive of his own mind. A few centuries later, Spain produced a monarch whose habits were equally disturbing. Philip V of Spain reigned 1700–1746, with a brief abdication in 1724. The grandson of Louis XIV of France, Philip inherited both immense power and a fragile temperament. Known for his bouts of deep depression, Philip would sometimes remain in bed for days, refusing to change clothes, bathe, or groom himself. In 1717, during one of his darkest episodes, courtiers reported that he had to be coaxed to eat and even to speak. There were times when he demanded that state business be conducted while he lay half asleep under his blankets. Ministers would bring documents to his bedside, and decisions were issued from beneath the sheets of a monarch who had effectively withdrawn from the world. Imagine an entire kingdom stalled because its rulers simply could not rise from bed. Across the Channel in England, Henry VIII reigned 1509–1547, is remembered as the king who broke with Rome and married 6 wives. But beneath the political drama lay a personal struggle with health that shaped much of his reign. In his youth, Henry was athletic and admired for his vigor. Yet after a jousting accident in 1536, he developed chronic leg ulcers that never fully healed. By the 1542nd, the once handsome king had ballooned to over 300 pounds, carried in specially reinforced chairs. Obsessed with finding cures, he subjected himself to bizarre remedies: poultices made of animal fat, strange herbal brews, and ointments of honey and vinegar slathered onto his infected legs. His kitchens prepared elaborate diets that he believed could restore vitality, but instead they worsened his obesity. His pain and frustration fueled a notoriously short temper, which many historians argue contributed to his increasingly tyrannical decisions in his final decade. Meanwhile, in Austria, Emperor Rudolf II of the Holy Roman Empire reigned 1576–1612, became infamous for his melancholia and obsession with alchemy. By the late 1592, Rudolf had retreated from most public duties, spending his days in Prague Castle, experimenting with bizarre medical treatments. He surrounded himself with astrologers, occultists, and physicians who promised to extend his life or cure his ailments. In 1606, his erratic behavior had become so concerning that his brother Matthias began maneuvering to seize control. Rudolf's eccentricity wasn't limited to science. He also collected exotic animals and oddities, believing they had mystical healing properties. His fixation on unorthodox medicine and his detachment from reality weakened imperial authority and contributed to instability across the empire. Even the seemingly majestic rulers of the 18th century were not immune to peculiar health rituals. George III of Britain reigned 1760–1820, is remembered for his bouts of madness, now believed to be linked to porphyria. In 1788, he experienced his first major breakdown, during which he spoke incessantly for hours, foamed at the mouth, and issued incoherent orders. Obsessed with maintaining control, he would pace the palace grounds in manic bursts of energy. Doctors prescribed bizarre treatments, blistering, purging, and even restraints. Although George recovered temporarily, his later relapses, especially after 1810, left him permanently incapacitated. His strange behaviors were not mere quirks but symptoms of deeper illness that shaped Britain's politics by forcing the establishment of a regency under his son. What ties all these monarchs together? Charles VI in the 14th century, Henry VIII in the 16th, Rudolf II in the 17th, Philip V and George III in the 18th is the tragic irony of kings who ruled nations yet could not govern themselves. Their quirks were not harmless idiosyncrasies, but obsessions rooted in illness, fear, and despair. And because they wielded absolute power, these personal struggles spilled over into public life, affecting policies, wars, and the fate of millions. Absolute monarchy was a gilded cage. Kings were revered, even worshipped, yet they were also isolated, cocooned by courtiers who rarely dared to contradict them. When Charles VI insisted he was made of glass, no one told him otherwise. When Philip V refused to rise from bed, government officials carried the kingdom to his bedside. When Henry VIII demanded bizarre remedies, physicians complied, knowing that to object could mean execution. In such an environment, personal obsessions grew unchecked, shaping history in ways both bizarre and tragic. By looking at these kings, we see more than eccentric habits. We see how absolute power magnified personal fragility. The padded robes of Charles VI, the bedridden decrees of Philip V, the festering wounds of Henry VIII, the alchemical obsessions of Rudolph II, and the manic wanderings of George III all stand as reminders that beneath crowns and titles, monarchs were still men, vulnerable to the same fears, illnesses, and frailties as anyone else. And perhaps that is the strangest truth of all. The rulers of empires, remembered for their grand palaces and mighty armies, often lived as prisoners of their own minds. When we think of royal daily life in Europe, we often imagine elegance, refinement, and a strict code of courtly manners. Yet behind the gilded doors of palaces, daily routines could be filled with bizarre rituals and eccentric behaviors. Some kings turned their quirks into spectacles, others into rules that shaped the customs of entire courts. From the 17th century to the 18th century, the oddities of monarchs became as legendary as their political deeds. Let us begin with Christian VII of Denmark, reigned 1766–1808. Crowned at just 17 years old, Christian quickly revealed troubling eccentricities. By the early 1772, his behavior alarmed not only his courtiers but the rest of Europe. Obsessed with mirrors, Christian would spend hours admiring his own reflection. He developed compulsive habits, scratching himself, cutting his clothes with knives, and hitting his body against walls. Sometimes, he amused himself by running through the streets of Copenhagen disguised as a commoner, harassing townsfolk with pranks. His reign became so unstable that real power shifted to his physician Johann Struensee, who effectively ruled Denmark in the early 1772. Christian's strange daily life was not merely private eccentricity. It destabilized a kingdom and led to scandalous palace intrigues. Across the North Sea in France, daily life at court was transformed into a theater under Louis XIV. The Sun King reigned 1643–1715. At Versailles, even the most mundane activities were turned into public rituals. Louis's obsession with ceremony meant that nobles considered it an honor to watch him wake, dress, dine, and even relieve himself. The Petit Lever, the Small Rising, and Grand Lever, the Great Rising, were elaborate events where only a select few courtiers were permitted to assist the king as he got out of bed each morning. Even his bathroom breaks became quasi-public affairs. According to reports from the 1682nd, Louis sometimes received ministers or nobles while sitting on his specially designed commode chair surrounded by courtiers. For Louis, daily life itself was a stage on which his absolute power shone. His quirks reinforced his majesty, yet for outsiders, they revealed the strangeness of a world where privacy hardly existed. Meanwhile, in England, James I reigned 1603–1625. The first Stuart king of both England and Scotland had his own unusual obsessions. James was deeply paranoid about assassination, especially after the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, when Catholic conspirators attempted to blow up Parliament. From then on, he developed an extreme fear of sharp objects. At court, he ordered that all knives used at meals must have rounded tips. This rule, introduced in the early 1602, may seem trivial, but it actually influenced European dining culture for centuries. Table knives with blunt ends became the norm. Thus, a king's personal fear became everyone's daily habit. Not all quirks were tied to fear or ceremony. Some kings cultivated collections and habits that bordered on obsession. Frederick William I of Prussia reigned 1713–1740, though remembered for his militarism, also had daily routines that astonished his contemporaries. He was fixated on soldiers of unusual height, gathering the famous Potsdam Giants, a regiment of men all over 6 feet tall. Frederick William delighted in watching them parade, sometimes waking up at odd hours just to inspect them. In the 1722nd and 1732nd, his obsession became so consuming that he paid extravagant sums to recruit tall men from across Europe. His daily joy was not governance or diplomacy, but watching his towering regiment march before him. Other monarchs showed peculiar dietary habits. King Louis II of Bavaria reigned 1864–1886. Though a bit later than our core focus, preferred solitary meals at midnight, often served on elaborate contraptions so that no servants would be present. Centuries earlier, in the late 1502, reports from the court of Henry III of France described his love of pet dogs to such an extent that he often dined and slept with them, neglecting human companionship. To outsiders, such behavior seemed childish or decadent, but within the insulated world of the monarchy, these routines went unchallenged. Then there were the collection's strange trophies that filled palaces. Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire, late 16th to early 17th century, reigned 1576–1612, maintained a cabinet of curiosities in Prague Castle. Among natural wonders and exotic treasures, he reportedly kept odd personal items, including clippings of his own hair and nails. Rudolph believed these objects had mystical or protective properties. In his daily life, this meant meticulously saving even the smallest fragments of himself, reinforcing his obsession with alchemy and magic. Even bathing and hygiene rituals could be sources of peculiarity. Louis XIII of France, reigned 1610–1643, was famously reluctant to bathe, preferring heavy perfumes and powders instead. His court adopted similar practices, and by the 1622nd, Versailles became known more for its overpowering scents than its cleanliness. Ironically, what began as one king's personal discomfort with bathing became a widespread aristocratic trend. By examining these daily quirks, we see how monarchs' eccentricities shaped not only their own lives, but also the culture around them. Christian VII's instability empowered others to seize control. Louis XIV's obsession with ceremony turned personal hygiene into a spectacle of politics. James I's paranoia reshaped European cutlery. Frederick William I's fixation with tall soldiers consumed state resources. Each habit was amplified by absolute power, spreading outward until it left its mark on history. The broader lesson here is that royal daily life was not merely personal, it was political theater. When kings acted strangely in private, it rarely stayed private. Courtiers, ambassadors, and chroniclers observed and recorded everything. Their quirks became legend, influencing both their reputations and the societies they ruled. Looking back, these daily routines remind us of the paradox of monarchy. Kings commanded armies and treasuries, yet they lived in bubbles where no one dared question their oddities. A man afraid of knives could change the shape of every dining table in Europe. A king obsessed with parades could drain coffers to recruit tall soldiers. A monarch who refused to bathe could set fashion trends based on perfume rather than soap. In the end, their lives show us how fragile the boundary was between majesty and absurdity. To their subjects, they were demigods. To history, they remained deeply human, sometimes tragically so, sometimes laughably eccentric. Eccentricities did not stop at private routines or personal obsessions. Many kings allowed their quirks to spill directly into the political arena. In some cases, these odd habits reshaped governments, influenced military policies, and even altered the destinies of nations. From the 16th century through the 18th century, Europe witnessed rulers whose peculiarities defined their reigns as much as their wars and treaties. One of the most infamous rulers in this regard was Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible, reigned 1547–1584. Though not a Western European monarch, His story illustrates how destructive quirks could become when wedded to power. Ivan was known for uncontrollable rages. In 1581, during one of his violent fits, he struck his own son, Ivan Ivanovich, fatally on the head with his staff. His paranoia also shaped politics. He created the Oprichnina in the 1562nd, a secret police force that terrorized boyars, confiscated estates, and spread fear across Russia. His ruling quirk was the belief that cruelty and suspicion preserved power, an eccentricity that plunged his kingdom into instability. In contrast, Peter the Great of Russia, reigned 1682–1725, displayed quirks that, while bizarre, were also reformist. Obsessed with modernizing his realm, Peter developed a fixation on beards. In 1698, after returning from his travels in Western Europe, he declared war on facial hair. Determined to enforce a modern look, he personally cut the beards of nobles who resisted and introduced a beard tax. Any man who wished to keep his beard had to pay and carry a special token proving he had done so. This odd policy was not simply vanity, it was Peter's eccentric way of forcing cultural change. His beard obsession became law, altering the daily appearance of Russian society. Moving to Central Europe, Frederick William I of Prussia, reigned 1713–1740, provides another striking example. Known as the Soldier King, he despised luxury and instead poured his energies into building the Prussian army. Yet his military passion took a bizarre turn. He became obsessed with exceptionally tall soldiers. By the 1722nd, he had created the famous Potsdam Giants, a regiment of men over 6 feet tall. He spent vast sums recruiting these giants from across Europe, sometimes even kidnapping tall men from foreign lands. For Frederick William, statecraft and personal obsession were inseparable. His daily joy was drilling his giant regiment, even using them as a kind of living decoration at court. This quirk drained the treasury and distracted from broader governance, but it also cemented Prussia's reputation as a militarized state. In France, political quirks were often bound up in ritual. Louis XV of France, reigned 1715–1774, had a curious ruling style. He preferred secrecy to open governance. By the 1742nd, he had developed the habit of bypassing his ministers and ruling through a network of secret correspondence known as the Secret du Roi. These clandestine letters, often penned between 1745 and 1760, pursued foreign policies hidden even from his official government. While ministers worked publicly on diplomacy, Louis XV secretly engaged in alternative negotiations, sometimes directly contradicting his own cabinet. This peculiar obsession with secrecy made his foreign policy unpredictable and weakened France's stability, all because one king trusted whispers more than institutions. England, too, saw monarchs whose quirks bled into politics. Charles II of England, reigned 1660–1685, was known for his love of animals, particularly dogs. This affection, however, went beyond private hobby. Charles allowed his spaniels to roam freely in council chambers, sometimes even disrupting meetings. Foreign ambassadors in the 1662nd complained that important discussions were interrupted by the king's pets. The breed known today as the Cavalier King Charles Spaniel immortalizes this peculiar political indulgence. Though charming to some, it reflected the king's tendency to treat statecraft lightly, frustrating ministers who sought his focus on pressing affairs. Back in Spain, Philip II, reigned 1556–1598, had quirks that turned governance into a grueling ordeal for his courtiers. Known for his obsession with paperwork, Philip insisted on reading and signing vast numbers of documents personally. In the 1572nd and 1582nd, ministers complained that state business slowed to a crawl because the king refused to delegate. His control freak habit meant decisions often took weeks or months, even in times of crisis. Philip transformed governance into a bureaucratic ritual that revolved entirely around his desk. an eccentricity that may have contributed to Spain's sluggish response to challenges like the defeat of the Armada in 1588. Some quirks were more symbolic. Charles XII of Sweden, reigned 1697–1718, had an obsession with war that was itself a ruling quirk. Unlike most monarchs, he rejected the luxuries of court life and lived like a soldier, wearing simple uniforms and eating camp rations even when at home. In the early 1702, during the Great Northern War, his refusal to negotiate peace and his addiction to constant campaigning drained Sweden's resources and cost the country its great power status. His eccentric preference for a Spartan lifestyle translated into national disaster. Taken together, these examples show how eccentricities were not confined to bedrooms or dining halls. They shaped armies, laws, and diplomacy. Ivan the Terrible's paranoia birthed a reign of terror. Peter the Great's beard obsession transformed Russian identity. Frederick William's giant soldiers became a symbol of Prussia. Louis XV's secret letters undermined France's diplomacy. Charles II's beloved dogs turned politics into farce. Philip II's mania for paperwork slowed a great empire. Charles XII's Spartan habits exhausted his kingdom. The pattern is clear. When kings ruled as individuals rather than as institutions, their personal quirks became national policies. In republics or constitutional monarchies, eccentric habits might remain private embarrassments, but in the age of absolute monarchy, a king's quirks could redirect the fate of millions. And so we are left with a paradox. The most powerful men in Europe often ruled not through reasoned statesmanship, but through the magnified reflection of their private obsessions. Their legacies remind us that history is not only shaped by battles and treaties, but also by the peculiarities of human nature, paranoia, vanity, secrecy, or sheer stubbornness that found their way onto the stage of politics. As we step back from the gilded chambers of Europe's monarchs, one truth becomes clear. Behind the crowns, the scepters, and the armies stood human beings, fragile, eccentric, and often overwhelmed by the very power they wielded. Their bizarre quirks, whether in private or in politics, remind us that absolute authority magnifies not only greatness, but also weakness. Consider again the examples across centuries. In 1380, Charles VI of France inherited a kingdom at war, but it was his delusion of being made of glass that defined his reign. In 1509, Henry VIII began as a vigorous Renaissance prince, only to end as a paranoid, obese tyrant whose medical obsessions warped his judgment. By 1643, Louis XIV ascended the French throne at 4 years old and transformed daily rituals, even his toilet, into political theater. In the early 1702, Philip V of Spain ruled from his bed, too depressed to rise, while Frederick William I of Prussia paraded his regiment of giant soldiers as if military policy were a personal hobby. Even into the 18th century, Christian VII of Denmark lived more as a court jester than a king, leaving governance to others. Each of these kings left behind more than odd anecdotes. Their quirks carried consequences. Charles VI's madness deepened France's crisis during the 100 Years' War. Henry VIII's insecurity reshaped England's church and monarchy. Louis XIV's rituals entrenched a system of privilege that, by the 1782, fueled revolution. Frederick William's obsession militarized Prussia, setting the stage for later wars. Philip V's withdrawal weakened Spain, accelerating its decline. Christian VII's instability allowed palace conspiracies that shifted Denmark's politics. In absolute monarchies, the line between personal habit and state policy was perilously thin. A fear of knives became a dining custom across Europe. A fascination with beards turned into a tax law. A love of dogs disrupted councils of state. A king's paranoia could condemn thousands, while his melancholia might paralyze a government. To live under these rulers was to live at the mercy of one man's mind. And yet, in these strange stories lies a lesson that transcends history. Power, no matter how divine it seems, does not erase humanity. If anything, it exposes it. The more absolute the throne, the more magnified the frailties of the man who sits upon it. These kings remind us that leadership demands not only authority, but balance, humility, and self-awareness, qualities many of them lacked. So as we look back on Europe's kings with bizarre quirks, we should ask ourselves, if we held absolute power, would we remain steady, or would our private obsessions spill out to shape the lives of millions? History's gallery of eccentric monarchs is both a cautionary tale and a mirror showing us how thin the line is between majesty and madness.